Welcome back to the channel and episode 2 of the kitchen project series. I've made some more progress on the kitchen install and had planned another CNC project video before this one, but decided it was probably just a bit too niche. See, the slope of the kitchen floor was a bit extreme and some of the kitchen feet were just a bit too short, so I used up some of the HDPE that I bought for the last video to make some feet extensions. It worked really well, and if I'd have spent more time on them they'd probably look like they were shop bought. The CNC once again proved to be a real help with making these extensions, but it just didn't seem like an interesting project for the series. But I did feel it needed a mention, as it was technically still a kitchen project. But hopefully this video is a little bit more interesting and more useful. In this episode I'll be making a drawer front for these drawers that I made. In fact, I've got to make quite a few more after this, but what makes this a little bit special is that they'll be engraved with text, which is a little bit different than the norm. When we bought the kitchen units, the company unfortunately didn't have any suitable units for us to build a walk-in pantry, so we decided to make our own. I made these units out of MDF and they're all just hand painted in a colour matched paint to the kitchen units. Some of the units will remain drawerless, but a handful of them will be engraved with either our own names for our own personal drawers, or engraved with things like bread and rice, etc. I made the drawers out of melamine boards, and they look a bit rough on the outside, but that'll be hidden by the drawer front and some screw covering stickers. So as previously mentioned, today's project is to make the engraved drawer fronts. It's important to somewhat familiarise yourself with your CNC machine and your software before tackling any project, but I class this project as a beginner level. The software that I'll be using for the project is Carve Pro. On my previous video I mentioned about using Aspire, but the majority of my projects seem to be simple 2D design, so it makes more sense for me to switch to Carve Pro, as this will pretty much do everything that I've ever covered without the distraction of all the other icons. Whilst the finished material I'll be using is oak, from a pre-made oak laminated pro board, I will be making a prototype out of MDF just in case I need to make any changes. Oak can be quite expensive if I make mistakes, so it's better to use the MDF first. The project will only require a couple of cutters, one to engrave the text and one to cut out the drawer front. So I'm opening up Vectric Pro and faced with the job setup screen. This will be a single-sided job type, and I'll make a 400mm by 400mm area for me to work with. My material is 18mm, but I usually add half a millimetre extra so I know that my cutter will pass through the material when it cuts its profile pass later on. There's nothing worse than lifting your workpiece off the CNC bed, only to find that the cutter hasn't quite gone through the material. Z0 position I'll be setting to the top of the material surface. XY datum I always take from the centre when machining, and I only really swap when I'm making a complicated design. The rest of the settings I'm not too concerned about, so I press OK and I'm ready to begin the design. Now I did make a paper template earlier, which I offered up to the drawer front to give me an idea of the design, which makes this next process easier. What does make this a little trickier though, is that the drawer front is going to sit inside the unit, so I'm planning on making it a couple of millimetres smaller than the opening, so that it looks right but it's not too tight that it will catch, and not too big a gap that it looks odd. So to start, I just make a rectangle with the rough measurements that I made for the paper template. This will be the MDF prototype just in case it doesn't quite fit, and if there's any issues it'll not be too expensive to tweak afterwards. There's a create vectors section on the left hand side with an option to draw a rectangle. From here we have a few options. I want to place the rectangle in the centre, so my anchor point will be in the centre with X and Y at 0. Corner type I'm leaving as square because the inside of the units are pretty square. To take any sharp edges off later I'll give them a light sanding. The size of the rectangle is 260mm by 210mm, and I press OK to create, then close the window. Rather than have a handle on the drawer front, I'm having a cutout at the top. I thought that the easiest way to do this would be to create a circle over the rectangle and use the circumference of the circle to create the cutout. I used my paper template to help with the placement of the circle. When in VCarve, I dragged down a guide to help by left-clicking and dragging from the ruler section to a distance of 72. I created a circle 150mm in diameter using the draw circle from the create vector section, and after selecting it, I moved it into place and it fitted almost perfectly. Now I could have used the create an arc tool, but this worked just fine. Now if I use the interactive trim tool and leave rejoin trim sections ticked, I can snip away the portions of the circle that I don't need, which will leave me a nice looking drawer front. Clicking on the vector will just make sure it's all joined up as one. To add the text, I just clicked on the Draw text under Create Vectors and typed in my name and resized it manually. This did, however, come with a bit of a dilemma. Do I centre the text to the whole drawer front shape, or from the bottom of the curve? I tried both positions and both looked alright. In the end I went for the centred to the drawer opening. I'm sure either way is fine, and it's personal preference I guess. And that's the design finished, and it's now time to switch to Toolpath commands. For the text I used the Carve engraving toolpath. Tool choice is down to personal preference, and I chose to use a 90-degree V-bit cutter. The 2D profile toolpath will cut the piece out, and I've used an 8mm downcut spiral, making sure to cut on the outside of the vector. I've added a few tabs so that the piece is held securely when it's being cut. The post-processor file is saved and the piece is now ready to be machined at the CNC. The two cutters that I'm using today are an 8mm downcut spiral from Wheel & Tools and a 90-degree V-bit cutter which came in a selection box of router cutters from Trend. Both have different size shanks, so it does mean swapping the collets when I change the tools over. As luck would have it, the prototype fits absolutely perfect, which is a bonus, so all I need to do now is machine the front in the oak. It doesn't look too bad, I think. I'm still undecided on the text placement, but if I spend my time worrying about which is best, I'll be here all day. All I've got to do now is make the rest of the drawer fronts and I can move on to the next kitchen project.